Welcome to the Vanderbilt Philosophy interviews. I'm here with Brandon Underwood, senior lecturer here in philosophy. Dr. Underwood got his undergraduate degree in philosophy at Birmingham Southern University. We actually had a sort of like a little overlap of time there. You were I had attended the Society for the Advancement of American Philosophy at Birmingham. So
the double oak maybe.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So we might have met at that.
But in the same room together.
That's right.
Yeah.
So and had more of a focus early on in continental philosophy, but then took a turn into classical Chinese philosophy, which then took you to University of Hawaii, where you wrote a dissertation on boredom. We're going to hear more about that. It's not going to be boring, but then with a bit of a genealogy of the Western concept of boredom, but then a kind of Chinese philosophical set of solutions with new concepts. So this is a really interesting arc into the discipline and a really wide scope kind of taste. What got you into philosophy, Brandon?
Well, a particular teacher got me into philosophy early. I went to an IB program, an International Baccalaureate program, and one of the kind of extracurricular options that we had was a philosophy class. And so his name was Martin Chambers. And I initially took the class just because he was teaching it, and ended up falling in love with the content too, and a couple of other things early on with philosophy that I interacted with. IB has another class that everyone has to take called Theory of Knowledge as part of the general requirements, and which is obviously logically oriented. So, it was mostly Mr. Chambers.
Mr. Chambers, giving philosophy to. I guess you were enrolled as a high school student at the time?
Yeah.
And so 15, 16 years old. Philosophy
16,
changes a life.
Yeah,
huh?
16. He had two classes. One was called just philosophy, and the other was called Western culture, which covered, art, music, a whole bunch of things. But it included some kind of philosophically leaning literature readings, and then the next class was full blown Plato, Kant type stuff.
So you showed up in undergraduate already knowing that you were going to be a philosophy major.
Yeah. I with a vague understanding that I wanted to pursue a graduate degree, even though at the time I probably couldn't have articulated what exactly that is. That entailed.
You wanted to be a professor.
I had a sense
like
that this is what
that life.
Yeah,
was
exactly.
Okay.
And so I also got some chances to teach during high school too, with elementary school kids. So I kind of already knew that I liked teaching as a general activity as well. So it kind of was coming together early.
What a great set of opportunities. And something maybe that we in the humanities should be taking some notes here as to the successes that it yields. So you ended up in Hawaii and is it specifically a kind of a Chinese philosophy program? Comparative philosophy, philosophy East-West is what the journal that they run out of there.
Yeah, philosophy East-West is the journal. Comparative philosophy in general, I guess, is kind of the umbrella term.
Okay.
Most everyone, although not exclusively, but most everyone focused on Indian, Vedic, early Indian, Japanese or Chinese stuff of one degree or another. And there was some other kind of more niche interests, but those were kind of the three main staples of areas at the time. So kind of all under the guise of comparative philosophy, where you're taking that one of those three traditions as kind of your main area of interest in the Eastern tradition, and then having some sort of touchstone in the Western tradition.
And you've been contributing to some of the debates about the methods in this philosophy, in this program of comparative philosophy. Your recent APA presentation touches on whether or not these Foucauldian archaeological approaches are appropriate. Can you tell me a little bit about what all that is?
So, well, there's one of my professors at UH, Roger Ames, is a big name in classical Chinese philosophy and religious studies and things like this. And he and a colleague made a claim in the 90s about the applicability of the Foucauldian methodology in general to comparative philosophy. Mostly their opinion was negative, based off of the ideas that Western conceptions of self are not useful for one reason or another for understanding classical Chinese philosophy, and so we should kind of move away from these various kind of schemes, and they characterize Foucault's methodology as falling under this one of these understandings of the self that are not particularly useful, and I just think that that's kind of a mischaracterization. So in particular of the archaeological method, early Foucault in particular, as opposed to kind of the post-1975 stuff.
So the Foucauldian archaeological method is an historical method, and one of the other parts of this that is sort of central to both your research and your teaching is the emphasis on knowing things about the historical epoch that things are happening in, and doing some really deep philological work.
Yeah, I mean, there's, especially with classical Chinese texts, we're talking about a time that's so far kind of removed, materially speaking, from the way that we live life and the way that we think about the world. You have to do a lot of kind of intentional hermeneutic work, right, to get down closer to get rid of some of the the prejudices, as Gadamer might call them, right, that we bring to the discussion without even necessarily thinking about it. This kind of how do we think about the nature of the self is one of these fundamental questions, right? So it's you really have to dig into the time period and understand kind of the material conditions to really understand why things end up the way they end up, right? Why is Confucius interested in archery and charioteering? It's not immediately...
Tell that story. This is such a good story.
So in the Zhou dynasty, which is the part of the major dynasty that Confucius existed under, in the first half of that, they set up a system of governance that includes 4 kind of groups, and one of those groups is a kind of scholar, official, lesser nobility group that Confucius is descendant from, and they at one point specialized in kind of charioteering and archery, specifically from chariots, and then over time, about 100 years before Confucius was born, is when we have the earliest bronze crossbow trigger from the archaeological record. So this is kind of leading up to Confucius is this time period in which there's this material kind of technological shift underneath this group where they kind of lose part of their raison d'etre, right? When you can just take a bunch of peasants and say pull the trigger and aim that way.
Point at that.
Right, exactly.
Right.
But then these kind of vestigial aspects hang on over time, where there's still this preference for charioteering as an activity that gives rise to like internal features that are appropriate to a good ruler or whatever, right?
You don't do it for the war anymore.
Right,
you do it for what it does to you.
Exactly. Archery is the same kind of. It's like but if you just approach the text and think, okay, calligraphy and charioteering, you're like, well, this seems like kind of incoherent, and it is incoherent from like an external standpoint. But if you kind of get into the material conditions and the history that the practice that the discourse is emerging out of, then it suddenly starts to kind of make a little more sense.
Yeah, they're these kind of focal practices that allow you to kind of build culture or build yourself, build intentions around.
And this is why Foucault's useful. The archaeological method in particular is that we want to look at the discourse, which the discourse is as it exists in these texts, but we also understand that this is always predicated, all discourse is always predicated on some sort of practice, like that discourses always arise out of and on top of practices. So understanding, kind of taking both a historical and a very intentionally hermeneutic, but also a very kind of practical approach to the text, in the sense that thinking that they're trying to do some sort of like highly abstract, highfalutin logic-based philosophy that we kind of naturally expect as philosophy is maybe not the best way to approach the text, right? So,
right. So
yeah.
knowing how they speak and knowing what they're working with helps you interpret properly. And this really pays some dividends with the term foo. So tell me a little bit about the number of intersections that you've seen here.
So this is what I'm working on right now, which is so foo is originally a tally. It's actually originally an imperial technology. The state would use these to authenticate orders, mostly military orders, but other things too. The image primarily being a broken piece of bamboo where kind of the edges of one side lock in with the other.
Okay.
To prove that both sides or that the orders are authentic in some way. And so this idea gets picked up in the very early strata of kind of quote-unquote philosophical Taoism from the late Zhou, Qin, Han dynasties, and it gets mixed up in kind of magical practices, essentially, magico-religious practices in which the foo is the idea of a tally, an empowering image that like validates some sort of process or inaugurates some sort of process.
It's like the impression of a signet ring or something like that.
Exactly.
Okay.
But it goes from being this kind of literal imperial technology into a much wider kind of magico-religious metaphor for engaging with various things, the spirit world, etc. Right? So this becomes kind of a fundamental magical technology throughout a bunch of different magico-religious practices in Chinese culture. We have as early as 168 BCE in the first half of the Han Dynasty, archaeological records, written record of the medical application of foo to treat poison. So they would draw this foo and burn it, and then the ashes would be put into a drink that you would then imbibe to help cure the poison. And then even later, after the Han, they kind of move into an even more liturgical kind of mode. They become part of, by the time you get to the Lingbao revelations, around the 4th century CE or so, they're this fundamental part of the Tao. They're these emanations of the Tao itself, right? So you can kind of see over the course of about 600 or 700 years that this idea kind of seeps in, which lots of things are always seeping into Taoism. That's kind of how it works. It collects over time. But this, looking at the kind of historical, practical uses of this technology, both in explicitly philosophical texts, but then also in kind of the other kinds of discourses that are kind of materially adjacent to Taoism in that early stage, like all these magico-religious practices, helps us have a better, more unified understanding of kind of these early strata of Taoist thought and this later quote-unquote religious Taoist thought.
That's the break that this is supposed to in some ways see something continuous.
Yeah, and the break itself is something that people have been somewhat skeptical of already for a while, but there hasn't been a lot of kind of positive examples of connective strands, right? And so I kind of want to get into a particular historical example and use that.
Kind of a speculative question now, kind of a little bit off of our off of the path. But is there something unique about Taoism that makes it culturally omnivorous in this regard?
It's not specifically Taoism. It's Chinese. I think Chinese culture more generally. Okay. So the three great schools, Confucianism, Taoism, Buddhism showing up kind of at the end of the Han Dynasty around 200 CE, give or take a century. They all operate on a kind of base level of Chinese folk religious practices that, of course, vary regionally and this sort of thing, but there's kind of a general base of magico-religious practices that is underlying all these different interactions. So they're not exclusionary in any way. If you might patron a Taoist deity if you have some particular issue that deity is known to service. Whereas if your grandkid's applying to law school, you're going to go hit Confucius up. If you et cetera, right? So there's not a kind of exclusionary dimension, and especially not a kind of epistemologically exclusionary condition like you see in the Abrahamic religions, Christianity in particular, where it's, in order to be a Christian, you have to believe in this one God and no other gods. It's much more of a, you got a God that does that, we got one that does that too. Let's, they can work together. Maybe they're the same God all along. There's just not this kind of cultural emphasis on, monopolizing stuff in that way, I guess, if that makes sense. So it's not necessarily, I think, a specific feature of Taoism, but more of a feature of Chinese culture in general. It's always been willing to subsume.
Yeah. So then it seems like there's a kind of a submerged third story that seems to be happening here, and maybe generally where these magico-religious practices are operating in the background, that philosophy is this kind of high rationalism, religion as another kind of set of practices operates between. Is that one of the, or is that too dichotomous?
No, maybe a little too dichotomous, but so there's not a ton of there's one kind of group from the pre-Han period that really is kind of seems to be explicitly concerned with what we would characterize as like logocentric forms of argumentation. We're looking at, the explicit argumentative criteria, categorizing like the language and like which words go together and can fit together and which ones don't, and this sort of stuff. But it dies out. The Moists, they're not found to be particularly popular. They're kind of known as stick in the muds. And, a little bit, yeah. They had the reputation of being kind of fuddy-duddies, perhaps, but yeah, it just kind of dies out. And there are a couple of other, spots where it very clearly capable of this sort of thought. It just is not as culturally hegemonic in Chinese culture as it ended up being in Western culture. And so, yeah, I mean, it's like there's the opposition between Confucians and Taoists, for example, was never really only intellectual. It's always also part of a market economy, essentially, of services, of religious services. The Confucians are ritual specialists, focused on the administration of the state cult from the early period, right? They're kind of the bureaucrats who specialize in how to get married and how to bury your grandma and how to make the appropriate sacrifices to the celestial powers or whatever. Whereas the Taoists seem to be much more culturally peripheral, but in a way in which they're kind of rubbing up against what are called fangshi, which is a general term for kind of magicians. It included divination, exorcism, pharmacological knowledge, all these sorts of things. And you see all this kind of really congeal together for the first time in the Lingbao revelations in the post-Han period, particularly in a text like the Lingbao Wufu Shu, which is literally the Lingbao's like 5 amulet text, basically, right? It's one of the foundational texts of the Lingbao tradition, and you see kind of all of these different threads really intentionally being kind of brought together with these magico-religious practices, but they're adjacent to each other already throughout time.
So we've got an historical approach here to these magico-religious practices and seeking divine dispensations and communication with these heavenly spheres or these heavenly bodies or these heavenly agents. Philosophically, hey, time to stick in the mud this. The philosophical approach that you've got is to see these as edifying practices. So tell me what that means.
Yeah, well, I think part of the thing is that like we can't. These practices persisted for centuries, so they there must have been some positive pressure.
They're doing
something.
Okay,
Even
what are they doing?
Yeah, and that's the question, right?
Yeah.
Even if they're not doing the magical thing that they say they're doing in the causal material realm, it still seems like maybe this kind of just like in any religious setting,
yes,
the kind of intentional and habitual engagement in certain types of practices can have a kind of edifying effect in one way or another. And this is the basic kind of technology underlying Confucian ethics as well. Engage in ritual in order to instantiate the appropriate kinds of relationships, which then will hopefully inculcate the appropriate types of like emotional dispositions, and then you have this alignment between the outer behavior and the inner disposition, and the world is ordered.
And things fit.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so the same kind of thing happens with Taoism, but instead of the same exact outcome, they're looking for something else. Early contemplative Taoism were trying to empty out the Shin, but that's still achieved through a particular type of alignment of the body, to other types of, macro hygienic practices of various kinds.
What's that mean? What's a macro hygienic practice? It's like that's not just showering.
Well, yeah, but it includes showering. But
okay.
Dietary restrictions, how bathing, sexual practices, a wide variety of kinds of different things. But because ultimately the body is a vessel for the circulation of qi, right? And so this kind of the various practices are oriented towards some sort of usually magical manipulation of qi inside of the body, but at the same time you're still engaged in slow-moving meditative exercise that has demonstrable health benefits, and everybody loves meditation now, right? And it's like even if you're not getting the Lord Lao to descend into your dantian to take up official residence, like
mindfulness still does something.
Exactly.
Okay.
And so looking at these technologies, these magico-religious practices, without really being concerned about the fact that they aren't literally real in a material sense, that they can still have something to offer us in terms of way of life, of personal practice.
So now I'm kind of, again, sort of veering off from our kind of plan. So do you have a view then about, because we've kind of shifted from saying, okay, we're talking about these magical religious practices to the edifying practices that we see sort of internal to them. Do you have a view about like what I was saying about like the mindfulness stuff, where it's like, okay, you don't have to have a view about the heavenly bodies and things like that to do the mindfulness? Some folks have had pretty negative reactions to that view, that you can't really do the mindfulness without these religious commitments, or in this religious context, or in this with these background commitments, that it's really a kind of play acting. What do you have to say about that kind of reaction?
I'm not super I'm not. It's not a concern that I share. So first of all, who's meditation, right? So like the meditative practices that we see coming out of the Shangqian, like say 600 CE on, right? These kind of what's usually called Neidan, or internal alchemy, which is what I was mentioning about visualizing the gods descending into your body and taking up residence in these different internal temples or palaces. This is all heavily Buddhist influenced form of Taoism from later in the medieval period, and it's a highly visualization based form of meditation where you have specific deities that you're trying to imagine, but that's not what they were doing in the pre-Han period. We don't actually know exactly what they were doing, but they definitely weren't like imagining a deified version of Lao Tzu, because he hadn't been deified yet. It was another 300 years before he'd be deified. So you can't chicken and egg situation.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
But very clear that time. You got to get that egg first. But anyway, the point being is that they were doing some sort of, it's called in the early Taoist text, the Zhuangzi, it's called Zuo Wang, right? Sitting and forgetting, and then we have a couple of other texts that describe in a very kind of terse way a meditative process that they were engaged in. But these are all basically student notes from an oral tradition of some sort, right? We don't have a clear, explicit explanation of how to do it, because you were being taught how to do it in a direct, interpersonal way. But they were doing something. But so, like, to say, well, maybe you do need, if you're going to do Shangqing Neidan, internal alchemy meditation, maybe you do need to, I don't know, even then the epistemological component isn't there in Chinese religions. It's not a necessary condition that you believe in the reality of Lao Tzu as a deity in order to be a Taoist. You just have to engage in Taoist rituals, and it's, you know, there's no one, you don't sign up at the Taoist church. I mean, like, monastic Taoism is this kind of a separate thing than the way that the lay people interact with Taoism, right? And so, like, to say that they're not, you know, it's like,
yeah, so this is a kind of an orthodoxy, orthopraxy division that's maybe artificial.
Yeah.
So, research program sounds like it's really, really interesting, and I'm glad that you're getting a lot of uptake with it. You're also getting a lot of uptake with your teaching. So these topics, you've got, super popular. The class on magical traditions and mystery cults has really taken off. Tell me about that class.
So this is part of the new core curriculum for the Arts and Science School. It's this part of the second year core, so it's supposed to be a big interdisciplinary question. And so our big interdisciplinary question is, what is the difference between magic and religion, right? And spoiler, there isn't any, really. Magic is traditionally just a term that
still have to take the class, folks. Stick around. But the butler did it, but it's a very interesting story as to how we got there.
Yeah, and you know, it's like, well, you know, the Greeks, they didn't do magic, they did theurgy. Yep. And then the Egyptians and the Persians did magic, and like, you know, it's the Taoists that are the, like, weird shamans and sorcerers, not the upstanding Confucians who are doing, you know, and so it's like
priestly,
right? It's exactly. So magic is just always whatever it is. It's always a kind of othering term that's deployed in this way, and so once you get over that, it's kind of easy to see how magico-religious practices are all kind of the same thing, right? Like baptism and the Eucharist, transubstantiation.
How'd you make that blood?
And like, it's pretty magical, right?
And I don't mean
it's
a priestly miracle.
Exactly. Well, and the thing is that the idea that calling something magical is pejorative is our problem.
Yeah.
It's not.
Good.
It's not a problem of the concept itself, right?
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be, at least. And so, and part of the thing is that these ideas, these magical ideas and these magical practices have gotten sidelined in our kind of understanding of the history of Western thought, despite the fact that, you know, Plato was probably, you know, initiated into a mystery religion at some point in his life, which is pretty magical.
Yeah, the Phaedo is an Orphic ritual.
Right,
There's no doubt about it.
And so so, you know, this was a real important, meaningful dimension of ancient people's lives, and if we're going to go to the trouble of trying to understand the things that they wrote, we have to take it seriously, not in a literal causal way, but in a hermeneutic way. And that's where people have a hard time making that jump sometime, right? Because magic isn't real. It's not worth talking about, and that's the non sequitur. That's the non sequitur. And so the class anyway is going to be a kind of comparative look at magical practices from the 2nd to 4th century CE in both Greco-Egypt, the kind of early strata of Hermeticism, the earliest kind of glimpses that we have of what would become the alchemical tradition in the West, and then also some corresponding practices from about the same time period in China, which also happens to be this period in which the kind of really the fusing of all of these magico-religious practices into Taoist kind of liturgy and thought is really happening. So it's a convenient kind of overlapping time period there. So we're going to look at those and try to see, you know, what's different. Here's how they were doing divination in Egypt. Here's how they were doing it in China. How do these practices that people actually engaged in, what do they tell us about the way that they must have conceptualized the cosmos, or conceptualized their obligations to other people, or the nature of their own soul, or anything like this, right? So it's like implicit in any of these practices is a system of thought and belief, and we can get that out if we're careful enough, I think.
Yeah, and so developing the skills of being able to interpret that, seeing the values behind it.
And so the class is called Taking Magic Seriously, right? Which is what we're trying to do. Take magic seriously. And so you also have got two really successful classes, sort of like brother and sister, or sort of cousins, or the Introduction to Asian Philosophy and the Advanced Asian Philosophy class, the 1004 and the 3004 classes. Yep. Tell me about how those two fit together. Yeah, bread and butter.
The bread and butter.
Yeah. And I love teaching them, so it's not a complaint.
They
are very popular. The first one, the 1000 and 1004, even though there isn't a strict prerequisite between the two, I try to kind of separate them for that reason, because sometimes you get people in 3004 that haven't necessarily taken 1004.
Don't do it in the order that the numbers come in.
So in the first class, in the intro class, I tend to focus on Confucian ethical and political philosophy from the Warring States period. So, like, basically 500 BCE to 221 BCE. That's all we really talk about. Confucianism and their major opponents, which actually don't, probably surprisingly to some, include Taoism. It's really the Mohists and the legalists, because the earliest Taoists are not super interested in political philosophy. They're kind of like, politics will kill you. Focus on, focus
one of the lessons of the Warring States, apparently.
Well, I mean, it was the Warring States, right?
It wasn't the peaceful ones.
It wasn't. No.
Okay.
And much to Confucius's chagrin. But yeah, so we focus on kind of that cluster of debates, and then in the 3004 class, I devote that to Taoism from the same time period. For the most part, we do kind of go a little bit beyond and look at some of those later magico-religious practices and how they related to this early strata of texts. But the 2/3 of the 3004 class is just devoted to the Tao Te Ching, the Zhuangzi, the Neiye, which is a very early meditative text that I mentioned. It's kind of a deep dive into the Taoist part from that time period.
So we've got the arc of the research and the teaching in ancient Chinese philosophy, classical Chinese philosophy. But then you've also got standing teaching capacities and teaching in 20th century continental philosophy, Kierkegaard and Nietzsche. Tell us about those classes.
Yeah, so, my familiarity with Kierkegaard really comes from his discussions on boredom, which the dissertation on boredom is also my connection to Heidegger, and then all of the philological work is kind of naturally led me to Gadamer and kind of hermeneutics and all of that. And then Joseph Tanke, a scholar of Foucault and Rancière, is a major fixture at University of Hawaii as well, so I kind of got into Foucault through him. So basically non-analytic philosophy from the 19th and 20th century, existentialism and hermeneutics kind of being the two main strains, because again, methodologically, hermeneutics is very useful for what I do in the classical Chinese sphere. And then the existentialist themes are, turns out ancient Chinese people also worried about death. a common, one of the few common material conditions that we share with them. So,
it seems to be one of the sort of the central rules of the game of being a human being.
Yeah, so there's some interesting things to be said there too, right? And one of the main classes that I've taught in that regard is 20th century continental, where we look at Heidegger, Gadamer, and Foucault. It's kind of our main hits in that class. But continental philosophy, lots of hermeneutics. Basically.
Lots of hermeneutics. Not just, you have to do the hermeneutics to read the material, and then you have to do and then the material teaches you hermeneutics.
It's a circle after all,
right? That's right. That's why they call it that, isn't it? Well, Brandon, thanks so much for
Yeah,
taking
yeah.
the time to talk with me about your research, your teaching, your path into philosophy.
Yeah.
And if you we'll have a link to Brandon's homepage down below, and so check out Brandon's teaching and other materials that Brandon's got. Dr. Underwood has got up on the web. Thanks very much.